What's up, people? My name's Anton and welcome to September. Today I'm going to be taking you through this simple crystal setup inside of C4D and Octane to get these colourful looking gems. There is a pretty simple setup, but from the get you wouldn't see there's a few little techniques which are used to catch the light in a pretty unique way. We're going to use some of C4D's inbuilt modelling tools like Volume Builder and Voronoi Fracture and whatnot, and we won't be using any plugins, so you are able to do all of this inside of C4D. Obviously Octane is a plugin, but that's a render engine we're going to be using, and it really helps achieve the look that we're looking for. So we're going to start in a new project. I'm going to close Octane for now so we can focus on the viewport, and you're going to get a pretty good idea of how we're getting this organic looking gemstone. What we're going to do first is open up a cube. Counterintuitive, I know. What we want to do to this cube is firstly make it editable to turn it into geometry, and then use Voronoi Fracture to split this in an organic looking way. I'm going to chuck the cube straight in, just like that. And what you can see here is each color is essentially a different piece, so it's shattered it like glass is the best way of thinking about it. We don't need to do much to this right now. All we need to do is hit C again on the Voronoi Fracture, and we can start picking away at pieces to find the most organic looking one. There's no real best way of telling. You can sort of be your own judge of this, but I tend to find that the ones in the middle are the best looking. So I've got my eye on this purple one here. I think by the looks of it, I tend to look for more longer pieces which are just shattered and have nice segments to them. This one looks cool. We'll run with that for now. I'm going to quickly select all of these and delete them. I can then grab this just here and rotate that so it's up, and this will be our asset. This will be our asset for today. We'll take that out real quick. So what I want to do with this is really quickly duplicate it, and this is an approach which I found and I sort of saw with actual ice. A lot of time gemstones and ice and a lot of these transparent materials aren't completely see-through. Obviously you can change the refractive index in Octane, but they will often have little shatters in them or little imperfections, which are one of the harder things to recreate in 3D, and I found this technique to make it quite nicely, in a bit of an interesting way, but it achieved a look which caught light really nicely. So here's how we're going to do it. We're going to take the duplicated piece and chuck that into another Voronoi Fracture, right? And that's going to re-shatter the piece that we've just created. Oh, cool. We're going to turn this down a little bit because we don't need this many pieces. So if we head into sources and then point generator, we can play with the points amount here, and we're going to make it, I say about 8. The more pieces you add, the more the light's going to refract inside of it, is the best way of thinking about it. But about 8, maybe less. Maybe we'll go for like 5. And that's given us a pretty good result. We're going to stick with the Voronoi Fracture for a sec and just head into MoGraph Effector, grab a plane which is going to affect all the pieces in the Voronoi, untick position, tick scale, and then make uniform scale so it's affecting each piece in exactly the same way, and scale this down very slightly. This is going to make a lot more sense in a sec once I actually apply a few more steps. What we're going to do is use a volume builder and subtract these pieces from the original fully sized bit, and what it's going to do is create a gem with these little ridges sort of echoing through the inside of it. Sort of hard to explain, but while you're changing these piece sizes and scales, what you really want to think is these bits here. These are what are gonna show in the final render. So I'm pretty happy with this, but I might go about making them a little thinner. So don't tweak this too much because the decimals get a little bit techy to use. If we just scale that down to about there, I say about 70% is a good amount. What we can do then is group these and just connect objects and delete, and that's just baked our mesh. Well, now we can remake this visible, and it's covered it all up, which is kind of what we want. And we can just head to Volume Builder. Volume Builder, I'll be honest, is sort of my best friend in C4D at the minute. Whenever I want to make anything easily, just playing around with geometry and whatnot to create some unique high density looking shapes, this always does the job amazingly. So things to bear in mind are cube fracture part. I believe this is our fully sized bit, is it? Yeah, that's our fully sized, and then the plane geometry is just our pieces. We want to chuck the fracture part in, and it's going to turn into voxels, and chuck our plane just after. And what it allows us to do is select the plane, so the pieces which are on the inside, and just set that to subtract. So the way you got to think about the volume builder working is it's taking the geometry and it's turning it into voxels, which aren't technically pixels, which is the reason you can only see them in dual shading. They are sort of cloud bits, I guess, and the way you got to think about it is the lower the voxel size is, the higher density it is, and this is going to relate to our final geometry as well. Something specifically with this is that 1, which is typically the lower size, wasn't actually small enough. You sort of get these like almost cheese gratery type pattern. That's not what you want. You want this to be quite full. You can see that when we get a volume mesher, which we'll eventually do and chuck it in, you get this weird pattern. So you need to make this even smaller. The number I used before was about 0.5, and there you can see we get the those are kind of filled up a little bit. The only observation I'd have at this point, and what you should be thinking about if you're trying to make this look authentic as possible, really gem, you can sort of see these rounded edges. Hold on, the rounded edges here. The best way to do that is to, firstly, so we can bake this now because those bits on the inside, you just can't see them yet. And we can head and get so there's two ways of doing this really. My first approach was using a subdivision surface, which rounds it a little bit. If we just let that process for a sec. But hold on, just bearing with C4D here. Cool. It sort of does it a little bit, but nowhere near enough. It's subdividing on a really small scale, to the point where you can almost barely tell, right? The better approach that I found was to use a smoothing effect just here, and if we just make that a child of the parent, the volume mesher parent, even that you can sort of barely tell, but it has this control here. So we turn the sniffness all the way down. There's an iterations tab, and if we make that about 100, I believe, you can start to see once it starts processing, you get this more of a rounded look. I'm going to pop this into hidden lines so we see what we're working with, and you can see the density of this mesh here. There's a little bit of clipping here, but that's not actually existence. We want a little more rounding, I'd say, to really get the gem look. I'm going to make this about 200. At this point, the geometry is starting to get a little unrealistic, but we're starting to get a look that we want. It looks like something you pick up at a park that looks really shiny, almost that sort of like pebbly type aesthetic, and we can run with that. So this is where things can start to get quite interesting. If we connect objects and delete again, just to simplify things, we're working with one geo. We can just enable the access real quick and drag this so that it is centered just like that. We can bring this to the middle just so we can start setting up our scene a little more, and we can head into Octane. So for that, I need to hop into my Octane setup right here. If you're working on one monitor, this is undoubtedly probably the best Octane setup you can have. Just Octane on the left, viewport on the right. And from here, we can quickly chuck a render, and we are going to do the holy grail of Octane setups, which is ACES path tracing. As far as render settings go, we want to hop in here, 2048, 16 GI clamp. You are pretty much finished at this point. What you want to do is get an Octane camera, and we can start positioning this so that we're left with a cute little setup that makes our gemstone really shine. We've just taken the gemstone right off the screen, but as you can see, that's because our camera is positioned wrong, and here we are. At this point, we can really quickly set up a HDRI just to get a little bit of light shining on the rock. Creative Office, no brainer, best HDRI and grayscale gorilla, and make this ACES so it's coordinated. Duplicate this real quick. Whoop. Duplicate, hop on here, clear, and set this to visible environment. So what that's just done is create a HDRI, it's reflecting off the rock, and we've created a black background. So we're not seeing loads of super distracting background content in our scene. So this is what we're left with at the minute. Very simple, but necessary. We're going to start making the materials now. So the materials start with a specular. What we're going to do is, apparently we need to let that generate for a second. Hold on. Maybe I didn't click it. There we go. There we go. They made it at the same time. We're going to chuck the specular on, and pretty damn quickly we're going to get a glass material, and you can start to see, if I just hop into the material real quick, camera, sorry, you can start to see what we've actually been doing with the volume builder. I'm just going to rotate this around a little more, and you can see that it's refracting the light in a really interesting way, considering this is actually the default refractive index here. I think we're using 1.3. The light is bending and warping through each of these sort of, unsure what to call them, fragments, I guess, of the crystal, and it catches light in a really, really sick way. It's a lot more interesting than just having the crystal by itself. So from here, we want to think about realism, we want to think about imperfection, and obviously color. The main sort of three things. And there's a few approaches to that. So we're going to start importing some textures into this. Firstly, if we're thinking about ice cubes, and for the sake of reference, I'm just going to show this little piece, which is actually what gave me inspiration for these rocks. You see these little imperfections, the sort of roughness, not quite fingerprints, but more scratches on the outside of the rock, because it adds a really interesting sense of hyperrealism. So you want to either source your own. I mean, you can go on Google and search, but you sort of want a more seamless resource. I've got a few in a design folder somewhere, which I'm about to find, which have sort of always done me justice. If I just head into, I believe my design folder here, other files. One of these has a few. I can chuck this in the description if I remember to. And we're looking for something like this. So I'm going to use a few of these, but namely, this is a fingerprint texture which I use, sort of high quality. I believe they're about 4K, and a grunge roughness texture. We're going to combine these in an interesting way just to really create those scratches on the crystal. So if we just go about, first off, mouse is double clicking for days, mate. Right. Cool. We're just going to grab these two, pop these in. There's no need for albedo, because obviously, firstly, we're working in aces, and secondly, we're working with the glass material, so it's not necessary. We're not projecting anything on the material as such. This is all sort of procedural approaches. Right. Getting on my tits now. Amazing. Cool. So here we are. Drag it, mate. Oh, goodness sake. Right. I've just created two of the same material. Bear with me for a sec. I hope you guys appreciate the imperfection, because I'm trying to get the message across. Cool. So texture 1, texture 2, and this is how we're going to do it. So one of these, I'm trying to remember which one I used originally, but I think it was this one. We're going to chuck it into the roughness channel, and pretty straight up you're going to see this is going to rough out the whole crystal. That is not what we want, but you can see the scale of it here, right? You can see these sort of like roughness, almost fingerprinty type patches, and the way it catches the light. We're going to shoot this in invert real quick, and what that's going to do is change the black to white and white to black, obviously. So here you start to see that this is sort of the white way around, but still a little weirdly mapped. That's because the material itself here is set to UVW mapping. So you want to make that cubic, and then tick that seamless, and that's going to make things a little more geometric. From here, we can minimize that tab real quick and just open up a UV transform inside of Octane. This is going to put a little nose to the side of it, which lets us transform things really easily. And it also means we can plug this into this texture when we start using that. So we just set this about 0.5, because right now it's a little big. And you can start to see some of the results we're getting. If we rotate this a little bit quickly, just to get a few more angles, you can see, hold on, hopefully. So you can see this looks quite good, but it's quite distracting. There's a lot of it. So we need to turn that down just ever so slightly. Best way of doing that, though, I've always found, is using a color correction inside of Octane, right? You can change the gamma somewhat inside of this texture just here, but it's this legacy gamma, not really enough control to get the sort of realistic results you're after. So we're going to hop into a color correction and we're going to change the gamma here a little bit. So down obviously makes it a lot brighter. We can see that straight away. And if we turn it up, we start to get more segmented pieces, right? And if we're just taking a look at this in general, you get a good idea. This is sort of what we're after. I'm gonna really quickly. They're a little too small, so I'm just gonna scale this up to maybe 0.75, so halfway, and that looks good. That looks good, I'd say. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna take we've already used up the roughness channel with this. I'd say this is pretty good for getting the look, and we're gonna take this other roughness texture we've got, and we're gonna use that in the bump channel. So if we disconnect this, just so we know what we're doing specifically, chuck that into bump. All likelihood we're going to get the same result. So what we're going to do is hop into this, invert this one more time, and you can still see that it's doing this. So that means it's likely too bright. Obviously this is grey, so when you go about inverting this, it's not going to invert it too much. It's sort of going to, you can't invert grey, right? If you're inverting black, it's going to turn white. If you turn it white, it's going to go black, but grey will pretty much stay in the middle. So what we're going to do is again mess with the gamma. So you can see straight away if we start turning that up, we want this to be quite subtle, otherwise it's going to distract from the fingerprints, right? And we want them to work together quite nicely. So I found the better approach was to make this quite subtle. And it's taking a little while to render, but you can see that we're really starting to get some scratches here, which are looking quite nice. And they look separate enough from the fingerprints, so it doesn't take away from them. And also looks realistically different enough. So I'd almost think we can run with that. Don't forget to keep your fingers on controller so when you're working with Octane, because it literally crashes all the time and you will regret it. And at this point we can literally take the other bit and just shoot that into roughness, and we can see the results so far. Don't forget to be critical as you like, really, when you're working like this, because I mean, ultimately, it's that critique which firstly helps you improve and secondly really gets you the result that you're after. So a lot of it's angles as well. I've always found that, something to bear in mind. So if we take this, so we're getting a pretty good result. Something I know I've forgotten to do is take the transform from earlier and plug that into the roughness channel as well. And what that's going to do is just sync them together so they're both scaled to 0.75. And from here, you can see we're getting a pretty scratched up little icy rock. I'm going to zoom out just a little bit so we can set this up. Oh, hold on. We're rendering away at the minute. But if I just hop in here and make this maybe more like 60, we start to get a nice little view of our gem. We're going to rotate her up. And you see how the HDRI is reflecting quite here. This is something I also remember doing. So we're going to hop back in here. Lights are really easy to catch in Octane, especially with the HDRI. If you've got a big window in your HDRI and you're working with any kind of glass, it is going to reflect bright white. So you want to tone that down slightly. If you hop in here, go to reflection, and just to check, this is the right. Yep, you can see that. If we turn that down, we've got no reflection at all. We want to make this about, don't turn off completely, right? Because no crystal doesn't reflect at all. But if we just slightly tone it down, it should modify our result to make it a little nicer on the eyes. 0.2. 0.2 works good. And bear in mind, obviously, when you let this render out, it's the little imperfections and the tweaks are really going to show. And this is what we're working with so far. This is pretty close to the final result, and obviously the more you create, the more you tweak, the more you change color. You actually have quite a lot of freedom with this. But if we hit W on our keyboard lets us rotate it in axis or just generally in relation to the world, you can start to tweak and find where the light hits best. If you want to take it one step further, you can even hop into the HDRI itself and start messing with the rotation Y and X. This is actually more important than you'd think. As you can see, some look, well, a little boring to say the least. And if you get the light to hit just right, you can get some super interesting results. So make sure you do play with this, because it does make all the difference in your final render. So if we maybe just nudge just a little more over so it catches the light, just like that. Maybe a bit more like this. Maybe up. A little bit of a shoot, rotate, just like that. We can even just go about kind of moving the rock so it's in the center of our scene a little more. And you're getting a pretty good icy crystal here. I'm just going to lock this real quick so it's rendering in the same resolution. So from this point we can start to think about color. Color in materials like this is done through the transmission tab, and you've got a lot of freedom. So pro tip, stretch this out because it is way too narrow here to start picking colors. If we use this just like that, we can start to pick. So we can go for an amber sort of orangey type, and you see straight away that it's far too saturated. No real gem is this saturated of an orange. So you need to take this lightness tab here and just tone it down a little bit. Obviously not completely white, but somewhere around here, just so it touches the gem, and you can start to see that it's looking really cool. If we hop back into that color chooser real quick, you'll realize that we start to have a lot of freedom. So we can hop in here and we can start making this more of a lime green, which really catches light in a cool way. We can even make this a blue, which is my favorite color. I always end up making blue things. More of an emerald even. So we've got a nice dark blue there. We can make it purple, though purple tends to be a little less realistic. You don't see purple gems like this a lot of the time, and it's good for fantasy pieces, but for some reason I always gravitate towards more realistic bits. We can make it pink, or more of a pinky red here. For me personally, I actually really liked this sort of like emeraldy color like this, and I'd be close to saying that's pretty much our final result. From this point, what you can do is, if you really want to change a little more, this is going to affect the render times a little bit, and it's going to create some varying results. But if we just store the render buffer here just to allow us to compare, we can go about changing the dispersion. So the dispersion is how glass or these sort of like crystally materials actually split red, green and blue light. So it's like RGB split in 3D. And we want to tweak this very sparingly. So if we make this 0.1, it takes it right to max. You want to make this 0.01, I'd say. And if we just smooth this over, you can start to see that it's taken our somewhat monochromatic result and added loads of like red, blue and green speckles, which are making it a little more complicated, but in the right circumstances, these really create some cool looking results. In this case, because of the way the light's already bouncing through these sort of sectors on the inside, I'd recommend really like not using this. It looks far simpler and it takes way less to render if you leave it. So for now we can enable over, yeah. So for now I say we can probably leave this. We can go about obviously tweaking the roughness and bump as you please, but generally this is a pretty good final result.